Welcome to Small Business, Big Network, the podcast for small business owners who want big results from their networking. I'm Liz Drury, a freelance voiceover artist who knows that if you're not working, then networking could help. Richard Askam is the founder or co-founder of a number of businesses and an expert marketeer and public speaker. He's worked with some well-known global brands, and his next project involves marketing on the moon. Thank you very much for being my guest on the podcast, Richard.
Absolute pleasure. Nice to hear you.
Now, Richard, I had a quick look at your LinkedIn profile yesterday to see what you're up to. And you're the founder of Woolly North, you're a co-founder of Ballpix and a co-founder of Gravity. All great names, but what do you do, Richard?
That's, my mother asks me that on a regular basis, and I still actually haven't found a good answer. But I guess what I do is sort of prod and poke things into life that maybe would not have come to life if they had not been prodded and poked. How's that as an answer?
Yeah, very woolly.
Well, there we go. I mean, the Woolly North thing, just to tell you about that, that was actually, it was a response to a comment made by probably one of my first major clients back in the day. And they asked where I came from, and I told them where I came from, and I said I was born in Cleanfeed, brought up in Grimsby, and live in Lincolnshire. And they went, "Oh, the wild and woolly north." So I called my consultancy the Woolly North after that particular derogatory comment, because there is nothing wild or woolly about where we live.
Absolutely not. So what's your background, Rich? Where did you come from?
Well, the drinks industry really is probably the one that my family is best known for. My father sort of entered into the drinks industry back in the 50s. So I was brought up in the world of alcohol, which is, a dream job for some people. But he was responsible actually for the first independent off license that was opened and licensed in the UK in 1965, I think it was. And this is, a world before supermarkets sold alcohol, a world really before anybody other than off licenses sold alcohol. So he came from a brewing background, worked for what was the Grimsby's big brewery, Hewitt's, as a stock taker. So his world was full of the knowledge of those products, and decided to go out on his own, which is possibly where I get it from. In the mid-60s, he was offered a choice by his boss: you either give up what you're doing as a side project, or you leave. And he said, "Well, there's my keys," and he left. So I do genuinely think I get a little bit of my independent streak from my dear old dad. The drinks industry was kind of where I was brought up, and to a certain extent, and I'm sure you've heard me say this before, what it turned out to be was the storytelling industry. Because what you can't possibly sell somebody a bottle of wine unless you tell them the romantic narrative that is wrapped around it. I mean, the reality is wine is alcohol suspended in liquid, but there's nothing sexy about that from a marketing perspective. So we like to spin stories, and I grew up doing that, and in fact this was in the heart of Grimsby, in the middle of the East Marsh. Down some very salubrious streets. My dad ended up with about 6 or 7 off licenses across the area, and that was my upbringing.
Yeah, and storytelling is a huge part of what you do now. I mean, I've heard you speak a number of times on stage. How did you get into that, being on the speakers circuit?
Totally by accident. Honestly and genuinely, I'm still, little bits of me are one of the shyest people you'll ever meet. My mum will back me up on this. When I was young and at school, shyness was the barrier to me getting on a stage and doing anything. The only thing I had in my locker, as it turns out, this is looking back, of course, from the grand old age of 54, looking back at my 14-year-old self, the thing I had in my locker was humour. And also, I think, the good fortune for my brain to be wired to my mouth slightly quicker, like a nanosecond quicker than anybody else in the room. So I got the funny comment in first. And that was my defense mechanism, to a certain extent still is. But it's sort of an inherent skill, I guess, that I've now discovered that I had. But I was too shy to go and use it until somebody very kindly asked me to come and speak at an event about the Coca-Cola project that I was involved with. And I stood up on a stage and sort of went, quite like this. And somebody said, you're quite good at this. And that was it. So accidentally, I entered the world of public speaking and have not stopped since.
So tell us more about the Coca-Cola project, because this one's brilliant. I've heard you talk about this before.
Well, again, a little bit of momentary luck. I guess most people's business careers are littered with moments of luck, good and bad, and you are neither in charge of either of those particular directions. But I guess to a certain extent, I've made a little bit of my own luck by being in a world of personalised products. The drinks business that I sort of entered into via my father morphed into a number of different iterations, as businesses should. And of course, as the competition grew, I had to keep moving ahead of it. Being a small business, you can do that. You can be nimble and make sure that you're constantly moving. And I ended up in a world where the only place for me to add value back into my products was to add personalised labels to them and sell them as gifts, because I was getting completely outsold by the supermarkets and the nascent sort of independent drinks business that had grown up since we started. So I found myself really sort of leading the way, 12 years ago now, with personalised labels on champagne, on Prosecco and so on, as gifts, sold across the internet by the likes of Not on the High Street and Moonpig and all the, buy me a gift, get me a gift, find me a gift.coms that were sort of blowing up at the time. And then along came Coca-Cola, and I was sitting very quietly, minding my own business on a train on the way to London, when an email dropped in saying, would you be interested in partnering Coca-Cola with their Share a Coke campaign? Which, of course, I said yes to instantly. Then I said yes again in case they didn't hear me the first time. And by hook or by crook, I asked them actually why me, and they said, well, we looked at everybody on the internet that was doing personalised bottles, and they were all supplied by you. So the logical map was to come back to the source. And Coca-Cola are an enormous... there isn't a word big enough to describe how big they are as a business, but what they can't do is one of anything. They could do a million, they can do a billion, they can do a trillion, but they can't do one. So what they needed was somebody that could break down their supply chain into individual single bottles and put people's names on them. And that's what we did, and built the website, mycocacola.com, can't remember it for a second, in 2014, and sold 1.8 million bottles of personalised Coca-Cola, one of which is sitting on my desk right now, across Europe. And it kind of became the moment that I always joke with people and say, if you play for England for 5 minutes, you are forever an England player. And so I'm always the guy that did the Share a Coke campaign.
Yeah. And do you think there's many other people like you that still have one of those bottles with their name on? Yes is the answer, because rather interestingly, especially because we were in charge of the element of it that was the glass commemorative bottles, not the cans and plastic bottles that were sold in store. We actually sold the glass bottles, so the original glass Coca-Cola bottles, which largely are keepsakes. And I was told by Coke that 90% of those bottles were never opened because they weren't bought to be drunk. Yeah.
And that's the point. And this is the point of personalised sort of gift to a certain extent. It's a gift that happens to be made of something. The gift is not the product. So I did Marmite, for example, for Unilever, and now I hate Marmite, as I'm sure 50% of your audience do, and the other 50% go, no, it's gorgeous. But the reality was, you weren't buying somebody a jar of Marmite; you were buying them a gift that happened to be made of it. And where they rather interestingly got it wrong, Unilever, was they had no idea that we would buy a personalised jar of Marmite for a friend that we knew hated it, just because it made us laugh.
Yeah.
So they misjudged that, and they could have sold 10 times more than they did. But that's the British humour for you.
So coming back to talking again, I watched your TEDx talk yesterday online. How did you decide what you were going to talk about?
Well, it was a bit of a challenge, really. I mean, first and foremost, it was and remains a badge of honour, because you have to be asked to do a TED Talk. You can't buy your way in. You can't sort of steal your way in. So, and it is, sort of the Champions League of speaking, to be able to put that on your CV. So when I was offered the opportunity, first thing I said was yes. I've got a habit of saying yes and then working out what to do later. And then talked to my wife about what on earth I should talk about, because the premise of TED is that it has to be an idea worth spreading. It can't be self-promotional. It can't be commercial. It's got to be interesting. And they are very qualitative in their approach to this. You can actually deliver a TED Talk, but if they don't particularly like it, they won't broadcast it.
Right.
And so then only the 100 people in the room will ever have heard it.
Yeah.
So it was quite the challenge to come up with something of interest and an idea worth spreading. And my wife, I was going to say my wife at the time, she's still my wife. At the time, my wife said, why don't you do something? And she's a personal trainer. Why don't you do something that revolves around exercise and use that as the opportunity to think and use that thinking as the opportunity to write? So I got embroiled in this mile a day challenge, and she basically challenged me to run a mile a day every day for a month and use that time, that between 7 and 10 minutes, depending on how I was feeling, to come up with an idea of a speech. And actually, the idea of the speech, as you heard yesterday, was that moment in time, that 5, 6, 7 minutes every day, was the anchor point in a freelance world that gave you structure. Because I came, like many people, came from a world where you're largely institutionalized by the walls that you work within. However pretty they are, you're still institutionalized. So when I went fully freelance in 2016, it was the first time I'd been free since I think the maternity ward when I arrived on the planet. And you have to learn how to deal with that. So the context of the TED Talk was how you live in a world without walls. And so I called it the loneliness of the short distance runner, paraphrasing really badly the famous book of the long distance runner. But it seemed to work, and to this day, Liz, I still get people watching it and ringing me up and saying, "Wow, that's made the decision an awful lot easier."
Yeah.
So it was great fun.
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting. And do you still run?
Not every day. So yes and no is the answer to that. I did during the first lockdown, like everybody did, and then I hurt my hip during the first lockdown, like everybody did. And so a combination of factors means that I've never been a runner, really. It was a contrived period of time. A, to keep my wife happy, and B, to try and do this particular challenge. But I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I'm an avid exerciser, but I'm not nothing either.
Yeah. No, I think it's an interesting idea though about having something that builds structure into your day. For me, it's walking my dog.
Yeah.
That's the first thing I need to do in the morning, and he needs to go out again in the afternoon, and I plan my day around walking the dog.
Well, we are by nature, I think, structured people. There's very few people that are free spirits, and there's many people that say they are, but very few that actually are. And I'm certainly not. I like structure. I like organisation. But my working life now revolves around multiple projects that happen at any given time on any given day. So there's no regularity and frequency to, right, I'm going to sit down and do some work now, because that's not how my life is. So in order to put that order into my world, that structural point, that anchor point was absolutely crucial. And you're right, it's still needed. My dogs get walked at virtually the same time every day, and that provides me with the bit of structure that I can hang the rest of my life on.
Yeah. Now, you talked about having multiple projects on the go there, and you're working on something really exciting at the moment. So tell me about gravity and NASA.
Well, yeah, it's just quite the weirdest happenstance, I think, that I could imagine. And it stems back to, and this is where you should always be careful who who's in the room when you're speaking, and also what you say, of course. I was in Chicago in 2017, I think. Was invited to speak at a conference about personalised Coke. There was a lot of people in the room from the big sort of commercial brands, wanted to hear how it was done and so on and so forth. So I found myself in the hotel where Al Capone spent his last days in Chicago, speaking to this audience. And there was a guy in that audience, as it turns out, who was interested in space marketing. Space being the next sort of untapped commercial opportunity. Really, we've kind of done everything on this planet. What's next, sort of thing. He waited about a year and then contacted me and said, "You're the Coca-Cola guy." And I go, "Okay, yes. How can I help?" And he said, "I'd really like you to help me with this project." And it was fascinating. The whole notion of space, I think, captivates all of us, which is why we stand out in our gardens and watch a white dot overhead, and they tell us it's the International Space Station, and we go, "Wow!" So it is still at that point of childish excitement for us. And yet, as we've seen in recent weeks, Mr. Branson has gone up, Mr. Bezos has gone up, Mr. Musk goes up on a regular basis. So it's not going back in the box, in terms of not just space exploration for science, but also for tourism, for commercial purposes. In fact, the International Space Station are currently working with Marriott Hotels as to how to create bedrooms.
Wow.
So this sort of stuff will come. So the latest project that we've been asked to get involved in as an agency, I actually came up with the name Gravity, mainly because I thought it was quite fun to have an email address that was gr@vity. So Gravity logo is just that. And we've been asked to sell the commercial space, a little bit like a Formula One car, on the next moon landing, which is in March 2022, which is the first one for 50 years. Nothing has landed on the moon for 50 years. And NASA and a company called Intuitive Machines in the US and also SpaceX are going to the moon next March. And part of my days at the moment is talking to people about selling the space and the digital payload to land on the moon. Wow. Careful what you say when you're in rooms.
Yeah, marketing on the moon. Who ever thought that would be a thing?
Well, do you know what? And the strapline, and I love the strapline, which is "The sky is no longer the limit."
Wow, yeah.
So I'm into, you know me well enough. I'm into all that sort of stuff. That just, I like standing in front of audiences and their reaction being, never thought of that before.
Yeah.
And if you can provoke thought, then you're doing your job as a speaker, I think.
Yeah. So obviously that was a bit of serendipity, really, being in the right place at the right time. But let's talk a bit about networking now and how you've used networking within your business in a more deliberate way.
Yeah, well, I'm not a natural networker. Ironically, I'm quite good at talking to people, but I don't like it when somebody goes, "Go on, then talk." It always feels a little bit like New Year's Eve when they say, "Right, now's the time to have fun." And you go, No, that's not how it works. You have fun when it happens. So I'm not a natural networker, but I do understand and completely appreciate the value of it. And I guess for the number of years that I've been around, I was talking to somebody about this the other day, that because I'm the son of a father who was in an industry that most people in this area utilised, because at some point, not everybody, but at some point, most people have bought alcohol from my dad. And so I'm connected to all of those people's sons and daughters by virtue of just history.
Yeah.
So my own network, as it were, has actually been proliferated by, are you Ralph Askam's son? Or are you Jane Askam's brother, which is the one that really irritates me. So I find myself with one of those recognisable names in a relatively small area. I mean, you know yourself, Liz, that it's a big village where we live.
Yeah.
And if you have one of those recognisable names, of which there are many, then at the very least you are already 2 rungs up the ladder before you've even started a conversation. I also had the good fortune, I think, to be in that industry that people are always interested in. What's a good wine then? Is always the one that you like is my answer. But at the very least, it spawns a conversation. So it's not like I'm selling loo cleaner or something that nobody wants to talk about, and therefore the conversation in those situations flows. So I've found myself to be adept at networking in situations that aren't necessarily created for that sole purpose. If that makes sense.
Yes.
And I think that for businesses, they shouldn't overlook the opportunity. Every time you talk to somebody is an opportunity to make a contact, is to make an impression, is to make somebody think, that guy knows what he's talking about.
Yeah.
And then you get these people that ring you back a year later and say, I want you to do something on the moon. This for me is the value of networking. It's not the short-term value. It's not what I can get today. It's sowing that seed in somebody's mind that when they come to need you or somebody like you, you've made the impression that allows them to think, I'm going to ring that guy up.
Yeah. Yeah, this is something that I spoke about on the podcast a few weeks ago, that networking opportunities are everywhere, not just at networking meetings. And I'm sure when you've given a talk, I'm sure that leads to lots of leads for you.
Well, 100%. And I mean, I do quite a lot of speaker coaching now with people that want to get better at speaking on stage. And in fact, the pandemic has been a hugely strange time for many reasons, but not least of which people want to get better at talking on Zoom. So I do a lot of that. And in fact, I'm still involved in the TED program because I'm currently coaching the latest crop of TED talkers for the Lincoln event that we're putting on in October. And the thing that I say to all of them is, rather interestingly, there is public speaking and there is speaking in public. Now, speaking in public is something that we all do every day, all the time. Standing at the bus stop, standing in the pub, we are quite happy to engage people in conversation. We don't see that as difficult.
Yeah.
And yet, the second you say, would you like to do some public speaking, everybody's terrified.
Yeah.
So to your point about networking, speaking in public is networking.
Yep.
It doesn't have to be at an event. You don't have to have a sort of a bad sandwich in your left hand and try and hold a glass in your right hand, and write down somebody's name with your other hand that you don't have. It is just literally taking advantage of the opportunity to talk to people. This is why I'm bang on all the time about the lost art of conversation. We live in a digital and technical world. Brilliant. That allows us to all do our jobs from anywhere in the world. Fantastic. But it shouldn't replace conversation, because that's what people remember. You don't remember the email, but you do remember the conversation. And so my advice to anybody listening to this today is talk to people.
Yeah, absolutely. So just finally then, what are your thoughts on the future of work and the future of networking?
I'm really excited about it, Liz. I think what's happened in the last 18 months has and will continue to revolutionise everything, I think. And anybody that's waiting for normal to come back is going to be hugely disappointed, because I think the world has moved on to the next normal rather quickly. We've been thrown into it in many ways, not by the way we would have chosen at all, but developmentally. If you asked any of the businesses that are now benefiting from this, they weren't expecting to benefit from this for about another 5, 6, 7 years.
Yeah.
And it's all kind of happened all of a sudden. So, and I go back to what I said at the beginning. I think I inherit my desire to be independent from my father, but also I quite like the point of change. The day that I'm most excited about in any business is the first day. And then actually the next one is the 100 days in, when you realise you've done everything wrong and you have to do it all again. So I think we are largely, as a country, as an economy, as a world, we feel a little bit like a startup. Which, if you embrace that and think, okay, we can't do any of the things that we used to do, but look at all the things that we can do now. It's possibly, ridiculously, and I mean this with all due respect to anybody that's suffered personally from the last 18 months, it's possibly one of the most exciting moments in our history. The biggest problem is, Liz, we won't be around particularly to enjoy it. It will happen around us, and then our children's children will study this era in history and go, wow, that was like the Industrial Revolution all over again. So it is historical, it's hideous in many ways, and it's exciting in many others. And I think if you can latch onto the excitement and go with it, then I think that the future's bright.
Absolutely. So just as a very last thing then, if people want to contact you, Richard, what's the best way to get hold of you?
Probably come and find me on LinkedIn. I think that's a good, from a business perspective, I do a lot of business on LinkedIn, and I've got a nice, strong network on there, which I can help people with, even if they're looking for somebody that I might know. I think that for me is a digital network that is probably under-leveraged by businesses. So I think, I would recommend come and find me on LinkedIn. It's ASKAM. There is no H in Askam. Everybody puts an H in again. No, you'll never find me. So come and find me, Richard Askam, on LinkedIn, and I would love to meet you.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Richard.
Liz, absolute pleasure. Take care.
Thanks for listening to Small Business, Big Network. If you found this podcast useful, please do rate, review and subscribe. And don't forget to share it with the rest of your network too.